Ons gesels oor bemarking en by my in die ateljee is Jess Jorgensen, Dali, Tembo en Jacques Burger. Jess, can you give us some practical examples of spaces where gender-neutral areas are created?
Okay, so there are many, but we've seen some very cool examples in the last few years, internationally and locally. So, for example, one of the biggest spaces in quite a physical sense that has always perpetuated stereotypes is things like the toy aisle, where you get sort of the pink aisle and the blue aisle in toys for kids. And there's a major retailer in the States that we know of called Target, for example, who have started breaking down those traditional styles of toy aisles to offer more gender-neutral toys, which is really exciting. In a local sense, and quite practically for everyone, is bathrooms. We've seen institutions like WITS, UCT, and many bars and restaurants in a social sense offering more gender-neutral bathroom services. So those are two examples within sort of retail and everyday usage. And then we also see a lot of examples within the advertising world as well.
Yeah, I mean, we also see examples, unfortunately, where it's not done well. So there's quite a big retailer in this country that ran a Mother's Day campaign in store earlier this year, and you've got a gondola end that says Happy Mother's Day, and it's filled with cleaning products, brooms, and kind of dishwashing liquid, and I think that doesn't help to counter the stereotype at all.
To that point, sometimes it's to the advantage of marketers to kind of write the stereotype. Do we still see that happening?
Do you know what? It's a really interesting time at the moment, because you'll have a situation like, we did a recent piece of research that showed us up to about 55% of households actually run by women. And yet, when you look at a lot of the advertising that's out there, sometimes you don't see that necessarily reflected. So those kind of instances give us opportunities to look at our spaces and see whether they're representing the actual way that reality is actually living out, as opposed to maybe how it's being represented.
Do you guys know of global brands that are really getting this right? So apart from just merely being sensitive to it, where it really forms an integral core part of the way that they do business?
I think there are a lot of brands that are definitely on the right path and on the right track. And there's also a discussion around, we've been talking about gender neutral, but we also need to discuss whether we're talking about gender inclusive, or terms like femvertising or bro-marketing. So those types of terms.
Okay, so let's go into that. What's gender inclusive?
I'll give a great global example. I think an ad campaign that we all probably might know about is an Axe campaign. Traditionally over the years, Axe has always kind of played into the stereotypes, portraying women in a more sexual nature, etc. And quite recently, I think it was a 2017 campaign, correct me if I'm wrong, they kind of blew the traditional stereotypes around masculinity and femininity completely out of the water with an ad that they released, I think it was last year. So that's a brand, in my opinion, who's making quite great strides, not necessarily gender inclusive, but just starting to challenge the stereotypes.
Dali, what's gender inclusivity then?
So gender inclusivity is much more about making sure that all the genders are represented in a way that is more fair, as opposed to what's happened in the past, where maybe there's been a bit of a slant into one direction or the other. I think the examples that Jess has mentioned are really great. Another really good example would be something like the rap industry, which has traditionally also had a lot of very big masculine stereotypes in terms of celebs, now being broken with someone like Mickey Blanco, for example, who's a gay rapper who's doing very well in the States at the moment. So we are seeing those boundaries being shaken, and that's what we are.
Look at Caitlyn Jenner on the cover of Vanity Fair. Brilliant example of how media becomes very powerful in addressing stereotypes.
And locally, on that note, and I'm sorry to interject, but also Laverne Cox on our local Cosmo magazine was incredible.
To what extent is it the advertiser's job to mirror society versus challenging society?
I think one's got a challenge, and in fact, I think we have a responsibility to lead. I think when we mirror, we reflect what's happening in society, and it's great for a brand to be a part of that conversation. But I think when you start to move into a really powerful space is where you're starting to lead the conversation. So you take a brand like Nando's with their #WriteMyName campaign, where they're going, well, just because your name isn't Western doesn't mean it gets a red line underneath on your computer screen. So how can we go about correcting that? And I think that's when brands step into a really powerful space in leading a conversation versus just following. I think there's big potential in that.
I think there's also consumers these days actually expect brands and businesses to get involved. I think what we're seeing a lot in a lot of our feedback, a lot of our responses as a research agency is we're seeing people saying, you know what, in my vicinity, in my area, I've been a patron of yours for 6 years, but I don't really get anything back outside of that. And so they're expecting brands to actually get involved, and certainly in the gender conversation, that's an area that's quite big at the moment and important.
Just what's your advice to agencies and their creatives? At one stage, people said, no, in order to be a great creative for an Afrikaans market, you have to be Afrikaans. In this case, how do we get creatives to think differently? So, because otherwise, if I put a certain creative in a box, aren't I just stereotyping yet again? What's your advice to creatives in agencies?
Well, I think it's the simple answer is not to hire women if you want to do an ad with women, for example. It's obviously a lot more complicated than that. But at the end of the day, it's just it's a responsibility not only on creatives but on brands. You know, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of voices and decisions that go into creating the work that we eventually see. Yeah. So I think it's not only up to creatives alone to get that message, but for everyone to come to the party. And essentially, the first piece of advice I would give, which is something we receive a lot from our consumer feedback, is to assess what the brand is about, and not necessarily jump onto a trend for the sake of jumping onto a trend.
Absolutely.
Because anyone can do that. But can we stick to the brand values while maintaining relevance with the consumer and not getting it wrong? So staying relevant to the social discourse at the same
Jacques,
time.
I want to talk about that, not getting it wrong. Do you think South African brands are so conservative that we're so scared of not getting it right or getting it wrong that we're doing nothing?
Yeah, I think we sometimes are too fearful of getting it wrong and not wanting to learn and grow and embrace that opportunity. And I think that, you know, it is about becoming more astute. I mean, one of the tricks, I think, is to just apply an empathy filter and to go, if we're developing a concept or dreaming up a campaign and you look at how people are portrayed in the communication, if that was your daughter or your son, would you be comfortable with that? If they had to see it, you know, if that was your sister in the ad, how would that make you feel? And I think that's one way of kind of starting to, it's a journey that we've got to go on, you know, this is just the starting point. But we've got to be brave enough to tackle it.
Guys, fascinating topic. Thank you so much. Die inskrywings vir die Pendoring-reklamepryse is oop en sluit op 23 Augustus. Ons gesels volgende maand weer oor bemarking en kyk dan na Nando's as 'n voorbeeld van goeie Suid-Afrikaanse reklame. Hierdie jaar se CEO Sleepout het slegs 12 deelnemers teenoor 250 van vorige jare gesien. Die Winslyn span was daar en het gaan uitvind wat presies tot hierdie ontoereikende deelname gelei het. Ons is terug net na die advertensies, bly ingeskakel.